righty. Hope you guys can hear me. Let's get started. I've put some messages in the chat window. I haven't heard back from anybody. If you would, somebody just type a message to let me know that you are seeing this. Hang on, got a little echo here. So welcome to the next installment in my series of product management webcasts. Today we are going to talk about product management in the context of complex environments, complex solutions. And I call them enterprise solutions. I'm going to define what that is. We'll talk about the complex problem space. We'll talk about where these ideas fit in terms of the whole range of product management kind of thinking. And I look forward to your questions. So I'm going to quickly jump to some slides. And here we go. So first, just a tiny bit about me. I am a consultant and trainer in the area primarily of software product management. I've worked at really big shops like IBM, Microsoft, came to work for SAP in Germany about 10 years ago and have lived here ever since. Have implemented Lean and Scrum several times. I'm now certified in SAFe, which is an approach to scaling Agile. And I do some guest speaking. At this point, I do more consulting than training. Earlier part of the year, it was kind of vice versa. But that's what's going on there. What are we going to talk about today? What questions do I hope to answer? First and foremost, what is the enterprise? That term gets thrown around a lot, but like a lot of terms in technology, we have an intuition what it means, not a definition. What does a complex solution look like? What am I talking about? What challenges do organizations face when they have to address the enterprise space? And how can development organizations scale? What are some of the considerations? What's the background? Well, you saw that I've worked in really big shops. That's where I spent my career. It so happens that not only were they big shops, but I was in the part of these companies that delivered solutions to other really big companies. And when I look at product management thinking today, when I read blogs, when I look at books, and when I look at hot topics, to me, things seem very startup focused, and that's exciting. That's good. There are a lot of great ideas coming out of the startup world, but some of the ideas, some of the approaches, I didn't relate to as much because I came from a much more complex environment. So when people would talk about their definition, for example, of minimum viable product, didn't exactly fit with my experience, what I encountered in really big shops. And I think this is an underserved area in product management thinking. What does product management look like with a super complex solution that may include more than software? We'll talk about that in a moment. So let's answer the question, what is the enterprise? People throw the term around constantly. And if you look at the definition, it really just means, at least kind of from a technology perspective, well, when I'm selling to organizations instead of people. Okay, that sounds good. The truth is, over the years, it's taken on a much richer connotation. And usually when I say enterprise, one way to think about it is scale, that I'm dealing with companies that are really large. And very often these organizations are very mature in terms of their processes, in terms of their roles. And more often than not, they themselves address a complex problem space. So you might be working with a company that builds nuclear reactors. Very complicated problem. How do you do that? How do you keep it safe? You can imagine. Or let's say a company that builds airplanes. It might even be a software company that does something like accounts receivable. These are very complex problems. And typically, that means that you need a pretty complex solution to address it. So when I say enterprise now, that's really what I'm talking about. Are these big companies that are addressing complex problems that are relatively mature. And when we talk about the problem space, it's really important that we think about problems and solutions differently. These things are essentially independent, although they can be related. So the problem space is just problems that an organization has. So these organizations are serving their customers. They're maybe serving very complex markets. We have to think about solutions that address those. And very often there are problems that can't be addressed by just a discrete little mobile app. Won't cut it. You need a lot more stuff. And I will give you an example later in the webcast. This came from masterfulmarketing.com. I love this comparison. So we can compare what it's like working in the consumer market, where, as I said, there's a lot of traction. Not everything is about these kinds of products, but a lot of what I read in product management, there are these people who have these cool services for people. And in that case, you have to be very product driven. It's a little bit different in the B2B case. As you'll see later, the transaction sizes are much bigger and the relationships are about trust. So you may engage with a prospect, somebody you want to sell something to, and it may be years before they buy. And once they're a customer, they can be a customer for decades. And that's a little more rare in the consumer space. There tends to be a little more churn. When I'm serving customers, I'm trying to maximize the value of the transaction. How much money can I get for this transaction? And in the B2B space, you're more likely to be optimizing for the relationship. So you may take kind of a longer view and think about, hey, over the next 10 years, what is the best way that I can make the most money? And that may mean not selling something now. So that's another difference. With consumers, obviously, there are 7 billion people in the world. You can't reach all those, but let's say millions, billions of people. And sometimes, depending on the problem space and the B2B side, there may be very few customers. There are niche markets, they're called, sometimes where you sell very specialized software or products. Let's say that you write software that helps people launch rockets. Well, there are only so many organizations in the world that are launching rockets. So you can imagine that the market is much smaller. People have a much simpler buying process. Sometimes it's really impulse buying, and enterprises don't tend to do that. They have obligations to stakeholders, they have mature roles and processes, and buying something is very complex with a lot of people involved. And we'll talk about those people a little bit later. Basically you can imagine that people, as I said, make these kind of emotional decisions. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, at least for the stakeholders, enterprises don't tend to do that. They really need to be convinced that you are providing a solution that makes a lot of business sense. And that's not something I tend to think about when I buy an app. Does this thing make sense? It's like, hey, this is cool, I want it, I buy it. And it goes from there. What are some other differences? When I'm dealing with consumers, it's a kind of, there are no roles. It's very specialized. As you can see later, the economic buyer is the user. When I'm talking about the enterprise, there is a very complex set of roles. Consumers may make many small purchases. These enterprises may only purchase once every 10 years. And when they do, it's a bet the business kind of investment. So another difference, a lot of the software we buy as consumers isn't exactly critical. If there's a problem with it, we get irritated. If Netflix doesn't work, that's a bummer. If Google Maps doesn't work, that's kind of a bummer. But when I'm running my business on something, you saw that I worked at SAP, they run some of the biggest businesses in the world. If there's a problem there, business shuts down. So the criticality is quite a bit different. And you can't really use the term customer in the B2B space or in the enterprise space the way you can use it with consumers. We use it, we throw that word around, but by itself in this complex problem space, it tends to be meaningless. It's a convenience. Oh, we have some customers in Asia. That means there are some folks that have bought our product, our solution, whatever, in Asia. But if we really look in detail, we'll see that there are a bunch of different people involved, a bunch of different stakeholders that have different roles. So when an enterprise makes a purchase, there's somebody who is the economic buyer who's actually writing the check. There may be a different decision maker. That may not sound intuitive, but it's the truth. One organization controls the purse strings. Another organization decides what they're going to buy. And then you have end users, administrators. You have people who influence the purchasing decision. And that may be the procurement or a purchasing department who has a very rigid process. They don't necessarily understand why this is being bought, but they will make sure that it's bought in the right way. that that there's a bidding process to make sure that they get the best price in the market for the solution that's required. And how many times do we see people, or do we as ourselves as product managers say, well, I talked to customers. Where were you? I was talking to customers. What does that mean? In the enterprise space, you really have to be more specific, and you should develop this kind of reflex if you're working in that space. When somebody says, well, the customers told us they didn't like that. Well, who was the customer? Was it the people who are buying it? Was it the people who are using it? Because sometimes these people have conflicting priorities and requirements. Something that's great for the end user is something that management doesn't want, the people who buy it, and vice versa. And of course, it can be very difficult to get a representative kind of insight about what customers want when we've only talked to 2 or 3. And it's a human tendency. We talk to 3 customers, they all say the same thing, and we tend to think, wow, this is a trend, this is meaningful, even though there's a chance those could be outliers, and what the market or what our other customers want is quite different. So when I think about this enterprise space from a development perspective, and primarily a software development perspective, we have to define different patterns because there are different characteristics. So there are some companies that are software companies that just create very complex software products. SAP leaps immediately to mind. Microsoft with Windows. It's software, but it's super complex. There's another type of company that doesn't just sell software. To solve their customers' problems, they have to sell hardware as well. They may have to provide services. They may have to help customers install it or use it or operate it. There can also be, this is another pattern, internal applications. So I might be a bank. A great example is where I started my career at a telecommunications company. We were building an extremely complex, huge piece of software. The only people who used it were employees. They used it to provision long-distance service to businesses. And in that case, organizationally, from an accountability perspective, if we think about stakeholders, customers, these are different scenarios. And we can think about other scenarios as well, where just the sheer scale of the problem and the complexity of the solution, it may actually be B2C, the end consumers may be customers, but it's just so complex that we have to think about development differently. And that's what I want to talk about today, is accountability, product management. And what we'll see is the way we typically think about product management may be insufficient in some of these scenarios. And today I want to focus on scenario 2. I want to focus on companies that go to market with what we will call solutions instead of just products. And I'm going to define what that means. But almost all of these enterprise scenarios or patterns have the same kind of challenges. They have very complex offerings from a technological perspective, from dependency matrix. They have trouble staying agile because they need a lot of formality to make things predictable. So changing very quickly can be very difficult. And even just from a communication perspective, getting a clear message out to a team that's distributed in 6 locations around the world is just an inherently difficult problem. Some of these products require complex ecosystems, something you don't run into as much in B2C. Sorry. In B2C, there could be an ecosystem that develops, but the dependency is a little bit different. So for these complex solutions, I need partners. I need people who can help me deliver this stuff. And in some of these organizations, I told you, sometimes they sell something to a customer and they don't have another opportunity to sell them anything else for 10 years. And in these cases, when you've got a lot of mission critical applications built on a certain technology, it can be very hard to upgrade that technology. So these are kind of common challenges. But when we think about accountability, when we think about product management, it's critical that we think about what specifically we're taking to market. We don't always do that. So from a software perspective, we can start with just a piece of software that I deliver to a customer. I might be a systems integrator. They need to put their, whatever, accounts receivable, they may need to connect that with some other system, whatever it is. So I understand their requirements. I create a product for them, a piece of software. Well, it's not a product, it's a piece of software. And we can ask ourselves the question, at what point does a piece of software become a product? Well, by my definition, it's when I intend to ship it to multiple customers and maintain it throughout its life cycle. So once that happens, the complexity of the problem goes way up. Now I need somebody with end-to-end perspective who can define a roadmap for that thing, who can make sure that it's successful in the market. Who is that person? You guessed it, a product manager. So that's what a product manager does. We can also think about services. That's an overloaded term, but in this case, what we're talking about are human services, human time and effort. So that is an offering that I can take to market. And very often, especially in the complex enterprise space, I package these things together. So here we're primarily talking about software, but I could also have hardware products. So I may go to market with some hardware, some software, some services. This can be a multi-million or even billion-dollar deal. And we call this aggregate, all these things together, a solution. And once you get to the point that you have solutions, you have to rethink accountability. So if I'm taking solutions to market, does it make sense for me to have just product managers? Well, it depends on how you define the role, but at least from a terminology perspective, it doesn't make, perfect sense, right? So let's think about that. What we'll focus on now is this number 2 scenario, which is delivering complex solutions. And we'll talk a little bit about what those look like, about what accountabilities can look like. And we have to think about cardinality. And it's important. Here we have an organization that has solution 1, solution 2, and we can see the components via these arrows. And we can see, for example, that software product A goes to market through both of those. And an interesting question we have to ask ourselves in terms of product management responsibility is, does that product A, go to market also directly? Do I sell it directly to customers, or does it always go to market through solutions? That has implications for who my key stakeholders are as a product manager. And then we have to think about, wow, we've got products covered, but what about these other things? What about services? What about these solutions? So it's complicated. One solution always contains multiple products, but a product may go to market through multiple solutions, may go to market on its own. I've seen both things. So I have a consulting client now. They don't sell products directly to customers. They always put them in a solution. They address very complex problems. So they would never just let somebody download a piece of software. They would never just ship them a piece of hardware. There's always a big project around installing it, getting it up and working. It's in the communication space, so really, really complicated. So what do these solutions look like in the real world? This is taken from my past, sanitized, simplified a little bit, but this is an example of a solution. It's called Eagle Eyes, and it's a surveillance solution. And the basic idea is, I may be a city, I want to keep my city safe, so I put cameras all around the city. I have people monitoring that video feed. Even more importantly, I have software monitoring that video feed so that when something happens, I know about it. So it alerts me when something interesting happens. It's always recording, so I can go back if somebody steals a car. If somebody gets in a fight, there's a chance that it's on video. I have a chance of finding it. Here's a very typical use case for this kind of solution. I have these cameras up. They have software running. It's called video analytics. Maybe on a city street, a bunch of people congregate all of a sudden. We can determine that through software. Hey, there are people getting together. And it's a time of night. It's in a location that shouldn't happen. So this video analytics software can raise an event. That goes to a control center or a command center. And I might be an operator. I'm sitting there doing my work, and all of a sudden an alert comes up that says, hey, a group is forming. I can then see that video feed. I may have procedures that tell me that I need to call the police. Whatever I need to do, that's the way this thing works. Here's a architecture for what this looks like, and we can see that we've got hardware involved. We've got wired cameras, wireless cameras. If we look at the control center side, I've got a bunch of software. I may have mobile applications. So I've got software that operators use. I've got software that administrators use. So by our definition, this is clearly a solution. The problem is kind of complex. It's not easy to surveil an entire city. To do it, I need the hardware, I need the software. And as a company, I may sell services as well. I may help the customer scope the solution, exactly what they need, where they need to put the cameras. I may hang the cameras for them. I may put the network up for them. I may even operate the solution so that the city isn't the one monitoring what's happening, but my company is. Hopefully a practical example. These are the offerings that Eagle Eyes comprises, and you can see we've got a bunch of software, does command and control, does the video analytics. I've got networking hardware, I've got video cameras, as I mentioned. I might have microphones, I might have radar, all kinds of things. And then I offer services. If you buy my solution, I will install it for you, I will operate it, and you can imagine how complex these things are. I've got a solution that addresses this surveillance problem space, and now I need somebody who makes sure that these things evolve together. So I may have features that require the camera to change, the software to change, and maybe new services. For example, education is a service. So if I have a new kind of video analytics or maybe a night camera infrared that can impact the software, I need new hardware and I have to train people how to use it. Who is making sure that those things work out? In a lot of organizations, they are delivery-oriented people, the people who are delivering the project, not somebody like a product manager who's back in the lab. And in many cases, that's problematic. That's an oversight. So here is a graphical representation simplified of the Eagle Eyes solution. It's up top. There's even slightly different graphical notation. It has rounded edges because it's a solution. The thick border means hardware. The simple square shape are software products, and then the ones without the edges are services. So you can see somebody needs to plan these things, define them, create a roadmap, make sure they work together. So we're used to thinking about product managers for software products, but now we might need in the lab, just like we need a product manager, somebody called a solution manager. And their job is to understand the markets, just like a product manager, define what we're going to take to market, work with sales and marketing, just like a product manager, except they've got a bunch of internal components, maybe some third-party components, and mostly what they're doing is coordinating their activity so that these things evolve in the right direction together. But it's not like I don't need product managers anymore. I still do. For my command center, somebody needs to understand what the next set of features are. They need to work closely with development to make sure it gets developed the right way. I might have sometimes one product manager for two software products. Maybe they're small. Maybe they don't merit having a single one. And this hierarchy can continue. Maybe I'm doing Agile. I have teams of 10 and there's a product owner. That's usually a different person. They work as a virtual team with product managers. And I might need a service manager, somebody who knows how to define the services. Because really, these are different skills. In a sense, they're similar. I have to understand customer requirements. But I can tell you, defining and managing a service is much different than a product. And it would be rare at scale to have the same person doing both. There's just too much work in both places. So if I'm building these solutions that bring these things together, what are the challenges that I face? There are a lot of them. I have to coordinate planning across all these teams. I need to know where I am, what is status. So if I have a new release of my solution that I'm working on, where are we? Are we on time? Are we going to make it? There's a really complex dependency matrix sometimes. These things depend on each other. The video analytics have to work with the camera. The service technicians need to know how to install it and maintain it, on and on and on. It gets very complicated. And in this complex environment, maintaining quality really can become a challenge because in some cases, it may even be very hard to replicate a real world scenario in the lab or in a controlled situation. So developing these things is really complicated. What happens to product management in organizations that take solutions to market? Well, it can change drastically. And if the product only goes to market through solutions, in other words, it's not sold by itself, your stakeholder changes. Now, instead of directly serving customers, you are serving the solution. They're the ones who are giving you the requirements. You still need exposure to customers. You still may need to understand markets, but your scope is narrowed. And a lot of this work of understanding requirements and trends goes to the solution manager. You know, now you may have a much more complicated set of dependencies that you have to manage, and the business case can be a lot more complicated because now you're going through solutions, and stakeholders are stakeholders. They're like customers. Like the solutions are like customers. They will always want more than you can deliver. So if you have capacity to deliver 4 big features, and between all the solutions, they need 10 of them, you're going to have to decide which ones you implement, and it's complicated. You need to understand the business case for sure. You need to make sure that you're not just implementing something that by itself won't be valuable as part of the solution. So your role as a product manager can very easily change in this world where I have complex solutions. Very different than when I have a discrete kind of customer-oriented product like an app. Yeah, the complexity goes way up, and now I have indirection between me and the customer. What are some tips if you're an organization that's in this world? You may already have product managers, but you may not have this accountability at the solution level. What I encourage organizations to do is build what I call an offering inventory. I showed you the definitions. I usually just do it in Excel at first. I sit with the team and I say, what are you taking to market? What are the software products? What are the hardware products? What are the services you offer? Now let's look at how those come together in solutions. And it's not uncommon for that to be the first time the organization has thought about it that way, to have in one consumable representation everything they take to market and the relationships between them. Once you have an inventory that people agree upon, you need to look at who's accountable for those things. So who's accountable for the success of the products? Who's accountable for the success of the solutions? And it's not unusual at all for there not to be a clear person who, from kind of a multi-release roadmap perspective, is taking care of the solution. And it's a mistake. If you need a product manager to manage the life cycle of a product, you need the same thing for a solution very often, especially if you're building the kind of solution where you package it up and you go out and position that with customers. So it's not like with each customer you start from scratch. You have a bunch of pieces together, maybe the 80% case. You sell that to customers, and with services you meet the last mile, the last 20% of their needs. You need to do really detailed stakeholder analysis. We talked about in this complex enterprise space, the term customer doesn't mean much. So who are you really serving? What are the requirements of the economic buyer? Who's influencing the purchasing decision? What do the end users need? What about the people who get the system up and running and keep it healthy, administrators? You need to understand them. You need to understand what their requirements are, where they don't match, and you need to make sure that you're talking to the right people. You will probably need to look at scaling your development. And that's a topic in and of itself. I've done a webcast on it. You can look at the history and take a look. I mentioned SAFe before. There are others. Scrum of Scrum is a framework or an approach. SAFe is one that I like, and they really look at this problem that I've got a lot of people, a lot of moving parts. What is kind of an organizational structure, a development framework or methodology that I can use to make sure that these pieces come together? And in this world, especially if you're transitioning maybe from having, just a couple of products to having a lot more, also offering software, you need to define PMs, roles, and responsibilities very quickly. You may need to think about having solution managers, the way I describe them, but the product manager needs to know, hey, your job now is to make the solutions happy. It doesn't do you a lot of good to talk to customers and come up with requirements that don't fall within the domain of the solution, because our intent is not to sell this product by itself. That could be one situation that you have to think of. So those are a few tips to think about this problem. It's a super rich, kind of complex problem in itself. I'm really excited by it. This idea of how I, as a big organization, make a complex solution so that I can sell to customers that have very complex problems. Would love to hear about your experiences if you have questions. I teach a product management course. I give them publicly. I also have it online now. So if you would like to get an end-to-end view of product management, it's basically a recording of, what was a 3-day course, very comprehensive, goes into a lot of details, talks about a lot of the things that I talked about today, these offering types and different types of accountability. You can go to my site, prickrell.com, and find out more about it. Take it at your own pace. You can still get internationally certified if you do that. So there are details on the site. And because you took the time to listen to my webinar today, I knew I wasn't going to, I always do that. I miss the date. I go through the slides. But if you sign up by October 15th, so by the middle of October, I'll give you a 20% discount on the online course. So just let me know. I'm going to shut the slides, see if you guys have any questions. You should be able to see a chat button. I would appreciate it if somebody would send some chat message, just so that I know that you're seeing it. Hello? Anybody out there? I hope you can see these messages. Google just changed Hangouts Online. So I don't know if all the bells and whistles are turned on. Hope that was really helpful. Hope that gives you this perspective. In summary, enterprise just means when we sell to organizations instead of people, but it's come to mean more than that. It's really about this idea of scaling. And once we have bigger customers with more complex problems, our solutions need to become bigger and complex. We need to think about what we're taking to market. If we're not taking just individual discrete products to market, we need to think about that, have the right accountabilities. So just like a product needs a product manager, a solution, in many cases, will need a solution manager. In that case, product management's role, you as a product manager, what you do, who you're accountable to may change from end customers to the solutions themselves. And as an organization, it's helpful to get your head around these things, to understand what you're taking to market, what the accountability should be. And with that, I don't see any questions. I hope it's just because people don't have them. If somehow this isn't working, you can send me email, greg@prickrell.com. You can contact me through my site. Once again, you can find a training schedule there. And you can also find a link to sign up for the online course. So thank you very much for your time, and I will see you next time, probably in 2 or 3 weeks.